Imagine this. It's February 1935. You're standing at a train station in Beijing, about to embark on a journey that everyone says is impossible. The route ahead? 3,500 miles through some of the most dangerous territory on Earth. Civil war is raging. Bandits control the roads. The temperature will swing from scorching desert heat to bone-chilling mountain cold. And you're a woman in an era when most women weren't even allowed to travel alone to the next city. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Ella Maillart, a Swiss adventurer who said nobody can go, then I shall go. Welcome to the Forbidden's journey. Before we dive into the adventure, you need to understand who Ella Maillart was, because she was already extraordinary before this journey even began. Born in Geneva in 1903, Ella, nicknamed Keenie by her friends, grew up reading adventure books by candlelight and studying maps of far-off places. While other girls her age were learning to embroider, Ella was learning to sail. At just 20 years old, she and her best friend Miette bought a 7-meter sailboat, restored it themselves, and sailed across the Mediterranean to Corsica and Greece. But here's the thing about Ella. She wasn't just a sailor. She was a champion sailor. In 1924, she competed in the Paris Olympics as the only woman among 17 male sailors. She was also the captain of Switzerland's women's field hockey team, which she'd founded herself at age 16, and an international skiing champion. But in the 1930s, being an accomplished woman athlete wasn't exactly a career path. Society had very clear expectations. Women were supposed to get married, maybe work as secretaries, and settle into domestic life. When Ella's father suggested she take a job as a bilingual secretary at the United Nations, she told him she'd rather die. And that's how, in January 1935, Ella found herself in Beijing, working as a correspondent for the French newspaper Le Petit Parisien, planning what would become one of the most daring expeditions of the 20th century. Picture Ella in Beijing, meeting with experts, trying to figure out a route west. Every conversation brings more bad news. At the Geological Institute, a priest tells her flat out, Chinese Turkestan is more taboo than ever. It's impossible to get a visa. If you try to slip in unofficially, you'll be arrested and sent back to the coast. The famous Swedish explorer Sven Hedin had been there, and even he had trouble. The Italian cyclist Orlandini had just been expelled. A young German had barely escaped with his life, and a guy named Hanneken, probably dead somewhere south of Hami. So what was Ella's brilliant solution? She decided to avoid all the known routes. Here was her plan. Travel from Beijing through inner China, then cross the northern edge of the Tibetan plateau, through a region so harsh, so desolate, that even the Chinese authorities didn't bother forbidding it, because who in their right mind would try? The region was called the Tsaidam. It was a massive desert plateau at 10,000 feet elevation where temperatures could kill you, where there were no roads, no maps, barely any water, where nomadic Mongols lived and felt tense, and civil war had left everything in chaos. And here's the kicker. Ella had to do all this without modern equipment. No GPS, no satellite phones, no gore, text jackets, or freeze-dried food. Just a Leica camera, a rifle, a bottle of Worcestershire sauce, yes, really, some, writing paper, 2 pounds of marmalade, and whatever she could carry. Oh, and one more thing, a travel companion named Peter Fleming. Ella first met Peter Fleming in a London nightclub months earlier. He was a journalist for the Times, and yes, his younger brother would later create James Bond. Peter was tall, charming, and had that very British air of treating life-threatening adventures like weekend picnics. When Ella asked him how to get into Soviet-controlled South China, Peter tried to discourage her, listing all the dangers and bureaucratic nightmares. As they parted that night, Ella said, "See you in China, probably." Peter looked at her, and he must have recognized that special glint in her eye, that determination that couldn't be argued with, because he simply replied, "Yes, see you in China." And in February 1935, there they were, boarding a train out of Beijing together. Now, this wasn't exactly a romantic partnership. Ella wrote in her journal that she wasn't enthusiastic about traveling with a companion, especially a man. She believed a lone woman traveler had a better chance of success. People underestimated her, which meant they didn't see her as a threat. But she also knew the journey might be so long and monotonous that it was wiser to be together, also in case it should land us in jail. The chemistry between them was complicated. Peter had a wicked sense of humor and cold pragmatism. Ella was more emotional, more interested in understanding the local cultures. Peter would spend his rest time doing Times crossword puzzles and playing solitaire. Ella would study the people around her, learning phrases in Mongolian and Turki, photographing everything. Peter joked that if their solitaire card games came out right, they'd make it to India. If not, they'd end up in a Turkestan prison. They were complete opposites. But Peter was, as Ella noted, born under a lucky star. She was going to need that luck. The first leg of the journey was by truck through inner China, and it was immediately clear this wasn't going to be easy. For 3 days straight, they were packed into vehicles with 25 other passengers, bouncing over terrible roads, breathing in dust and exhaust fumes. When their first truck broke down after just 4 days, they had to negotiate for a new one. The driver pulled off the road to sleep whenever he felt like it. Punctures happened constantly. At night they'd stumble into village and stark, muddy places where the only light came from a piece of cotton, floating in oil in a broken bowl. The beds were raised platforms of hard earth called kangs, sometimes heated from below, sometimes not. Ella would hunt for food in the markets, often finding nothing but onions, oil, and occasional eggs. And the cold. Oh, the cold. Even though it was supposed to be spring, snow kept falling. Ella wore her Chinese fur cap with the ear flaps down and wrapped herself in her big winter coat, the same coat she'd later give away as a gift when she finally reached warmer climates. After a week of this, they reached Lanchao, a city of 500,000 people that considered itself quite civilized, even though it was already 12 days' journey from the coast. And this is where things got really complicated. Police came and took their passports. Officials wanted to know, who were they? Why were they here? Where were they going? For days, Peter and Ella sat in limbo, drinking tea at the China Inland Mission, playing cards, wondering if they'd be turned back before their adventure even really began. The problem was simple. Foreigners weren't allowed in the West. The roads to Sinkan Chinese Turkestan were closed. Civil war was raging. The authorities didn't want foreigners getting killed and creating international incidents. But Peter had an advantage. He was English, and the English had a certain prestige. More importantly, he was a correspondent for the Times, one of the most important newspapers in the world. After much negotiation, many cups of tea, and probably some calculated flattery, they got their passports back stamped with permission to travel. Ella's passport included Sinkang. Peter's didn't, which she thought was hilarious and never let him forget. They were free to continue. But first, They had a crucial task: finding guides and supplies. At the town of Tanjar, Ella and Peter finally assembled their expedition team. First, there were the Smirnovs, a Russian couple, Stepan and Nina, who knew the Tsaidam region and could speak Mongolian, Tibetan, Chinese, and Tursi. Stepan was a former Cossack who'd been living among the nomads for years. Nina was charming, capable of making bread and managing horses, truly a child of the steppe. Then there was Li, a gentle half-Mongol, half-Chinese lad who would lead them to a caravan heading west. And finally the animals, camels, horses, and eventually a pony named Slalom, who would become Ella's faithful companion, and a horse Peter bought from a llama, which he named Graze. Graze turned out to be a temperamental nightmare who once threw Peter off and trampled him, but that's a story for later. The supplies were equally important. They packed bricks of tea used as currency, samba toasted barley flour, the staple food of Tibet, rice and dried fruits, medicine including a brand new typhus vaccine, ammunition, a gramophone with 3 records, Peter's typewriter, Ella's beloved Leica camera. That camera would document everything. Ella took photographs constantly of people, landscapes, the daily life of the nomads. These weren't tourist snapshots. They were anthropological records of cultures that were about to change forever. But before they could use any of this, they hit another roadblock. At Lanshao, Chinese authorities suddenly decided the Russian couple couldn't continue. The Smirnovs were suspected of being Soviet spies. After all they'd been through to arrange guides, Ella and Peter would have to go on without them. It was devastating. But Ella and Peter had come too far to turn back. On March 29, 1935, 6 weeks after leaving Beijing, they finally set out for real. Just the two of them, Li, and their animals, heading toward the great solitudes of Asia. For the first time, I want you to really imagine what they saw. Miles and miles and miles of absolutely nothing. The Tsaidam plateau stretched over 400 miles, a sea of yellow-gray earth, broken only by occasional tufts of dead grass and twisted bushes. The ground was so salty it glittered white in places. The sky pressed down, enormous and empty. Sometimes they'd see a black tent in the distance, a Mongol camp, and it would be the only sign of human life for days. They traveled at walking speed, about 15 miles per day. Hour after hour, Ella would sit on Slalom, watching. The horse's shadows slowly moved from one side to the other as the sun crossed the sky, to keep from going mad. With boredom, she'd recite poetry to herself, or make up games, or study the faces of their Mongol traveling companions. The Mongols fascinated her. They lived in felt yurts, round tents that could be packed up and moved in hours. They wore sheepskin robes with one shoulder bare, even in freezing weather. They drank salted tea mixed with butter. They never washed, believing that clean water was full of evil spirits. Ella, who spoke some Russian, could communicate a little through various interpreters. She learned that the Mongols were oppressed by Chinese merchants who loaned them money at impossible rates, slowly stealing their wealth. She learned about their religion, a mix of Buddhism and ancient shamanism. She learned how to treat sick camels. You stab them in the nose with a hooked needle to relieve congestion at high altitude. It sounds brutal, but it works. And she learned about hardship. One day, their oldest camel simply stopped walking. It knelt down and refused to get up, staring into the distance with what Ella described as eyes looking into the other world. They had to abandon it. The caravan. Code was strict. You didn't show emotion when leaving an animal to die. To show attachment might anger the spirits and bring bad luck to the other animals. A few days later, another camel collapsed. Then Peter's horse grew dangerously ill from bad water. And then came Slalom's turn. For months, Slalom had been Ella's constant companion. She'd ridden him through sandstorms and snowstorms, across frozen rivers and burning deserts. He was comfortable, she wrote, which might not sound like much, but after 8 hours a day in a wooden saddle, comfort meant everything. Slalom had personality. He'd stick his head into their tent at dinner time, hoping for treats. Once, starving, he'd crunched on an antelope bone Ella had thrown away. He'd drag Peter's stubborn pony along when it refused to move. But on the 6th day crossing the desert, Slalom began to weaken. He stopped eating. His ribs stuck out. Every few hundred yards he'd stop, his head hanging down. Ella tried everything. She fed him dried pears mixed with samba and raw meat. She gave him her own ration of sugar, but mountain sickness or perhaps the alkali water had taken hold. On their last morning together, Ella made him a special breakfast. She coaxed him across one final river. They made it to the other side, and then 50 paces beyond the river bank, Slalom stopped. Ella called to him softly. She knew he was at the end. Peter caught up with them. They transferred Ella's saddle to another horse. Ella kissed Slalom's nose, and then they left him standing there, alone, in the vastness of the desert. I went away, Ella wrote, leaving my little horse motionless in the solitude behind me. This is what the Tsaidam demanded. This is what that landscape took from everyone who crossed it. Not just strength and supplies, but the things you loved. But Ella and Peter kept going, because that's what explorers do. After 12 brutal days crossing the Tsaidam, they finally reached a place called Nomo Kantara I, camp with actual people since they'd left the last town. And here they ran into a problem they hadn't anticipated. Nobody would rent them camels to continue west. The trail ahead led to a region in the middle of a civil war. Turkestan was fragmenting. Multiple warlords were fighting for control. Soviet troops had just intervened with airplanes and bombing campaigns. A legendary Muslim general named Ma Junying had mysteriously disappeared. Some said he was in Moscow. Others said India. Still others said he was dead. The point was, nobody wanted to go there. And without guides and camels, Ella and Peter were stuck. For days they negotiated. They offered money, tea, cloth, anything. They visited Mongol princes. They drank endless bowls of salted tea. Peter's Chinese improved rapidly from necessity. Ella photographed everyone, building goodwill. Finally, they made a deal with a man named Asa Khan, who agreed to lead them toward Sinkang, but only partway. He'd take them to a place called Bash Malgun, where Turkish-speaking Muslims lived. After that, they were on their own. It would have to be enough. On the 5th-10th of May, they left Nomo Kantara and headed south toward the high mountains. For the next week, they climbed steadily upward through increasingly barren terrain. The air grew thinner. Every night was freezing. The landscape turned lunar, nothing but black rocks and patches of snow, with the trail marked only by the bones of dead animals from previous caravans. At one point, they crossed a pass at 16,000 feet. Ella and Peter had to walk, pulling their animals along, stopping every 20 steps to catch their breath. Quote, the camels were stabbed in the nose to make them bleed, relieving the pressure of altitude sickness. And then, finally, after climbing for days through this dead landscape, they descended into a valley, and at the bottom was something Ella hadn't seen in weeks. A tree, not a forest. Not even several trees. Just one scraggly juniper, twisted by wind, somehow surviving in that wasteland. Ella almost cried at the sight of it, because where there was one tree, there might be water. Where there was water, there might be grass. Where there was grass, there might be people. They were entering Turkestan. Imagine the sensory overload. After weeks of nothing but wind, sand, and silence, Suddenly there were mulberry trees, canals of clear water, fields of corn, the smell of cooking bread, roosters crowing, children playing. On the 10th of June, 4 months after leaving Beijing, Ella and Peter rode into the oasis town of Churchin. It was a miracle they'd made it at all. Their Chinese escort soldiers took one look at them and escorted them straight to the authorities. Were they Russian spies? Who had given them permission to be here? What were they really doing? For hours, Peter negotiated in his improving Chinese, while Ella waited nervously. But eventually, maybe, because Peter represented the times, maybe because they were clearly just exhausted travelers, they were out to stay. And this is where the journey transformed from desert survival into political intrigue. Churchan was controlled by Muslim warlords called Tungans, ethnic Chinese who followed Islam. They were at war with the Chinese government to the north, at war with other Muslim factions, and dealing with Soviet interference from the west. The local commander, a young general, everyone called the Little Colonel, invited them to dinner. He was fascinated by these foreigners who'd crossed the Tsaidam. How was the situation in Manchuria? What did people in Beijing think about the war here? Would the League of Nations help them? Ella, who spoke Russian, suddenly became their most valuable diplomat, because Russian was the lingua franca in this part of Asia, and she could gather information that Peter, with his Chinese, couldn't access. She learned that the legendary general Ma Zhengying, the Lawrence of Arabia of Central Asia, had indeed disappeared. Some said Moscow, some said Tashkent, some said he was dead, but his forces still controlled the southern oases. She learned that Soviet advisors were spreading through the region, bringing modernization, which meant schools, hospitals, and also secret police. She learned that the locals were caught between worlds, ancient Islamic traditions versus communist atheism, nomadic life versus settled agriculture, independence versus outside control. After 5 days of rest, eating fresh bread and apricots, sleeping in real beds, they prepared to continue. The next town was Karya, 12 days away. Then Khotan, the capital of the Tongan Republic. Then Kashgar, the legendary Silk Road city, the gateway between China and the West. If they made it that far, they'd be safe. The British consulate was there. India was just over the mountains. But first, they had to cross the Takla Makan. The name Takla Makan means go in and you won't come out. It's one of the world's largest sandy deserts, a sea of dunes stretching for 500 miles. In summer, temperatures hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. There's no water, no shade, no vegetation. Ancient Silk Road caravans would lose dozens of animals and men crossing it. Even with modern equipment, it's deadly. Ella and Peter crossed it on donkeys. For 12 days they plodded from one tiny oasis to the next. Each stage house was just a mud hut beside spaced a day's journey apart. They'd arrive in late afternoon, exhausted and coated in dust, and the innkeeper would bring them bowls of watery soup and hard flatbread. The heat was suffocating. Ella developed painful lumbago, her back seized up so badly she could barely dismount. Peter's nose was burned raw despite his efforts to protect it. Both of them were losing weight rapidly, on a diet of mostly samba that toasted barley flour mixed with tea and whatever game Peter could shoot. The monotony was crushing. Hour after hour, nothing changed. Just sand, heat, the plodding of the animals, the squeaking of the saddles. To stay sane, they talked about books they'd read, about London theater, about whether the League of Nations could prevent another European war, about the perfect dinner they'd have when they reached Kashmir. Peter would say every evening, 60 lists nearer to London, just to annoy Ella, who wanted the journey to last forever. And every evening, Ella would photograph the sunset, the camels, the inn courtyards, documenting everything with her Leica, knowing these ancient ways of life were about to vanish. On July 1st, 1935, exactly 5 months after leaving Beijing, they rode into the great city of Kashgar. Kashgar. For centuries, this was where East met West, where Chinese silk met European gold, where Buddhist monks met Muslim traders, where the Silk Road split into northern and southern routes around the deadly Takla Makan. Marco Polo passed through in 1273. So did countless explorers, adventurers, spies, and diplomats over the centuries. And now, in July 1935, Ella Maillart and Peter Fleming joined that distinguished company. They were met at the gates by Arthur Barlow, the British vice-consul, who led them through fragrant gardens to Chinny Bog, the British consulate. It was like entering another world. English lawns, flower beds, indoor, plumbing with hot water, armchairs covered in chintz, books everywhere, and best of all, a table laden with sandwiches and hot scones swimming in melting butter. 2 lumps, please, Ella said with her best society smile, trying to hold her teacup steady. Yes, thanks, we had an excellent journey. For the next few weeks, Ella and Peter lived in luxurious comfort. They played tennis badly, neither knew how. They attended diplomatic dinners. They met with Soviet and British officials, gathering intelligence about the political situation, because Kashgar in 1935 was a spy's paradise. Everyone was jockeying for influence. The Soviets wanted control of Central Asia. The British wanted to protect India's borders. The Chinese wanted to reassert control over their lost province. And various warlords and independence movements wanted to create their own nations. Ella, with her languages and her journalist instincts, was perfectly positioned to understand what was really happening. While Peter wrote reports for the Times about military movements and political intrigue, Ella photographed ordinary people, farmers, merchants, women in the bazaar, children playing. She understood something that the diplomats often missed. Revolutions and wars aren't just about governments and armies. They're about people whose lives are torn apart by forces beyond their control. But Kashgar, comfortable as it was just a pause. Their destination was still ahead, India. And to get there, they'd have to cross the highest mountains on earth. On August 8th, 1935, Ella and Peter left Kashgar with a new caravan, 5 ponies, 2 Chinese soldiers as escorts, and a servant named Nayez. Their route would take them over 3 massive passes in the Pamir and Karakoram mountains, including the Mintaka Pass at over 15,000 feet, the border between China and India. The first days were deceptively beautiful. They rode through valleys carpeted with wildflowers, gentians, edelweiss, enormous marguerites. Clear streams rushed down from glaciers. The air smelled of pine and wild chamomile. But as they climbed higher, the landscape turned harsh again. They crossed the Chichiklik Pass in a snowstorm. Their horses struggled through scree fields where one wrong step could mean a deadly fall. They forded icy rivers where the current could knock a horse off its feet. At one crossing, Ella's horse stumbled and went over sideways. She was thrown into the torrent, everything she carried, notebooks, films, cameras, soaked through. It took hours to dry everything out, unsure if months of photographic work had been destroyed. But they kept climbing, up and up and up, through valleys that felt like the end of the world. And then, on August 22nd, they reached the base of the Mintaka Pass itself. The final climb took 2 hours. It was steep, brutally steep, with switchbacks that made no sense. The thin air left them gasping. The pack animals collapsed every 100 yards and had to be revived with the nose. Stabbing technique Ella had learned from the Mongols. Snow was falling, the wind howled. Ella could barely see Peter ahead of her through the blizzard. But finally, they reached 3 cairns of stones at the summit, 15,600 feet above sea level, the highest point of their entire journey, the border between China and India. Behind them, 4,000 miles of Asia, 6 months of hardship, countless brushes with death, bureaucratic, nightmares, political intrigue, lost animals, ruined equipment, and sheer stubborn determination. Ahead, the Himalayas, glittering in brief sunlight that broke through the clouds, the dwelling place of the snows. Ella stood there, letting the others go ahead, waiting for the mist to clear, and then she saw it. A triangular wall of snow and ice towering into the sky. The Mintaka Peak, one of the faces of the Hindu Kush. So far, Ella thought, I like India. Ella Maillart and Peter Fleming descended the Mintaka Pass into the valleys of Hunza, where they were greeted as honored guests by local princes. They rode through forests and green fields, such alien concepts after months of desert. They stayed in rest houses with beds and chairs. They played polo with local champions. They were feted at banquets. On September 12, 1935, they rode into Srinagar, Kashmir. 7 months, 3,500 miles. By train, truck, horse, camel, and on foot. From Beijing to India, they had done the impossible. Peter Fleming went back to England, wrote a best-selling book called News from Tartary, and became a celebrated author. He'd later serve in British intelligence during World War II and live a distinguished life, but he never did another journey quite like this one. Ella wrote Forbidden Journey, which became her most famous book, but more importantly, she continued traveling. She crossed Afghanistan and Persia. During World War II, she spent 5 years in India studying Hindu philosophy, transforming from external explorer to inner seeker. In 1951, she became one of the first Europeans allowed into Nepal when it opened its borders. She fell in love with the Himalayas and spent the next 30 years leading tourist groups there. She built her first permanent home at age 45, a chalet in the Swiss Alps, but she never really stopped wandering. At age 83, she made her last trip to Tibet. Ella Maillart died in 1997, at age 94, in her mountain home. So what was this journey really about? Yes, it was about adventure, about pushing human limits, about crossing forbidden territories, but it was also about freedom. Ella lived in an era when women were expected to marry, raise children maybe, work as secretaries. She refused every one of those expectations. She built a life entirely on her own terms. Adventurer, photographer, writer, philosopher. It was about documentation. Ella's photographs and writings are now in UNESCO's memory of the world. Register. They're invaluable historical records of cultures and ways of life that have vanished, and it was about understanding. While other travelers wrote about conquering exotic lands, Ella wrote about learning from them. She questioned her own assumptions. She asked, "Who am I?" In every new place she visited. She once said, "Others are keen to see if natives other than us live better than we do, without heat in pipes, ice in boxes, sunshine in bulbs, music on discs." In other words, maybe Western civilization, with all its technology, wasn't obviously superior. Maybe these primitive nomads had something we'd lost. That was a radical idea in 1935. It's still a radical idea today. The world Ella Maillart documented in 1935 is gone now. The Tsaidam has roads, Kashgar has airports. You can fly from Beijing to Delhi in 6 hours. But the spirit of her journey remains relevant. The refusal to accept impossible, the courage to venture into the unknown, the willingness to let a journey transform you. Ella's travel credo was simple. Nobody can go? Then I shall go. Maybe it's time to prove them wrong. This has been the Forbidden's Journey. I'm your host, and Ella Maillart is my hero. Now go have your own adventure.